There we go. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event, Trapped in a Cycle of Violence, the Reality for Refugees and Migrants in Libya. Before we get started, on behalf of Natasha and myself, I'd like to take a moment to thank all the panelists and our moderator who have graciously accepted the invitation to speak today. We are very grateful to have you here. And on behalf of everyone at the Libyan American Alliance, a warm welcome to everyone in the audience who is joining us this afternoon. And so we're all brought here today by the Libyan American Alliance, a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit, nonpartisan group dedicated to advocating for the rule of law, democracy, and respect for human rights in Libya. And to further the Libyan American Alliance's mission statement, we have invited subject matter experts and practitioners to share their experiences and discuss their perspectives on the migrant and refugee crisis in Libya. So I, along with my colleague Natasha, will be co-hosting today's event. But before we invite our esteemed guests to share their expertise and observations, we would like to introduce you to the Libyan American Alliance's fall 2021 policy paper, which is the motivation behind today's event. So Natasha and I have recently co-authored a paper titled Trapped in a Cycle of Violence, Transnational Human Trafficking and Smuggling of Refugees and Migrants in Libya. By releasing this paper, we really hope to raise awareness about the protracted and often overlooked crisis by highlighting the pull factors for mixed migration from sub-Saharan North African countries, the government corruption and collusion between Libyan authorities and criminal actors, the systematic human rights abuses at DCIM detention centers and holding facilities, and the role of militias in the circular extortion economy. Along with this, our paper offers several short and long-term policy recommendations for the US government that include the imposition of sanctions on those complicit in human trafficking and smuggling activities, and also the support of local NGOs. Natasha, you muted.
Thank you. A large portion of our paper is dedicated to the refugee and migrant experience in Libya, and here we provided a few examples. Upon arriving in Libya, migrants and refugees risk being kidnapped either by their smuggler, criminal gang, armed militias, or traffickers, to be later ransomed, indentured, or auctioned off as day laborers. Once released, migrants and refugees are at risk of being arrested and detained by authorities, whereby these vulnerable populations are either extorted for their release, face indefinite detention in makeshift prisons or DCIM controlled centers, or will be deported back to their countries of origin. And even if refugees and migrants do make it to the seaside departure points, those intercepted in the Mediterranean by the European-funded Libyan Coast Guard are hauled back to Libya and detained once more. And within this detention system, migrants and refugees are subjected to squalid conditions, abuse, sexual and gender-based violence, hunger, and lack of basic rights and access to essential services. And we look forward to hearing from the panel of experts on some of these issues. And we are grateful to be joined today by so many distinguished guests. And we're grateful to have in the audience important US officials like John Pannell, Director of USAID's Libya program operating out of the Libya External Office in Tunis. So for now, I would just like to introduce John Pannell. He is a career member of the US Senior Foreign Service and is a country representative for USAID in Libya. Prior to assuming this position, he served as the Deputy Mission Director of the USAID Regional Mission to Ukraine and Belarus from 2015 to 2019, helping to oversee the agency's largest mission in the region and its efforts to counter malign Russian influence. For now, John, if the floor is yours, if you'd like to talk about the US government's position and USAID's work in Libya. Over to you.
So John hasn't joined us yet as a panelist. I don't know if you're in the audience. Maybe.
No problem then. We can go ahead and just actually introduce the moderator. So to guide us.
That's okay, but if he's here, let's see if he can promote him. Do we know if he's here?
Well, I don't see his name. I don't know if there's Middle East. I don't know if that's possibly.
I'm assuming that's an organization.
Yeah.
So he's not here yet?
I didn't see that he's here yet. I think we can just.
Well, he's more than welcome to join us at the end. Yep. After. Okay. So
right.
Then To guide us through this discussion is our moderator for today's event, Dr. William Lawrence. And Dr. Lawrence is an expert in his own right, having lived and worked for 15 years as a senior diplomat, analyst, and international programs director in 7 countries in the Middle East and North Africa. He is a former State Department Libya desk officer, and he served as officer in charge of Tunisian and Libyan affairs in the US Embassy in Tripoli, where he helped negotiate the first US-Libya bilateral agreement in decades. Previously, Dr. Lawrence also served as the North Africa director at the International Crisis Group, and he is currently a professor of political science and international affairs at American University. Dr. Lawrence, thank you for joining us today, and over to you.
Thank you so much, and congratulations to Libyan American Alliance for another timely and important event. Timely, ironically, in the sense that the 5 other Libya events in Washington this weekend that I attended were all on the elections, and that's not the only thing going on in Libya, and we don't even know if they're going to happen on the 24th. So I'm really glad that you're paying attention to such a critically important issue. Let me also say that the paper is a triumph, and congratulations to you guys for producing it. And I hope everyone on the call today that hasn't had a chance to look at it does get a chance, and I'm sure that will be made available to you as has been indicated and promised. By way of introduction, let me just say something quick. In 2013, when I was on a flight from Tunis to Tripoli for Crisis Group, 2012, my good friend, Chris Stevens, was killed in Benghazi. Following that, one of my many trips to Libya over that period, I wrote a piece in Foreign Policy called something, I think it's Libya's Peacekeepers. And the point I was trying to make was that militias were not just bad. Militias were good and bad. We don't have a revolution in Libya without militias. We don't have a current political process guaranteed to be more democratic than not right now without militias. And Crisis Group did a study with Small Arms Survey at the time of all the militias. And we determined that about 80% of them were revolutionary and on the up and up, let's say. About 10% of them were in pro-Gaddafi areas and sort of organized during and after the revolution in the pro-Gaddafi areas, which is very much in play right now in the discussions about Libya. And about 5% were criminal and about 5% were jihadist. When we talk about militias in Libya now, they all are doing different things, although there's some conflation over their roles. But I'd like to say it's the criminal gangs, which existed before the revolution, going back to the 90s, if you read some of the books on Libya, drug smuggling gangs, trafficking gangs, they were already there, that continue to create a horrible situation in Libya for the most vulnerable. The second point I'd like to make is that I've worked in foreign affairs now for over 35 years, and sometimes the ethical, moral, and policy issues get confusing. Things come into conflict. And the rubric I always use is, when I'm confused or not sure about what position to take or what to take action on or what to think about an issue, is how does this thing I'm considering affect the most vulnerable populations? And when that's been taken care of, I feel like I'm on the road to finding the right way forward. It's sort of a bottom-up metric for judging what I'm doing and what my government's doing and what other governments are doing, what the NGOs are doing, et cetera. And that's why, in many ways, this migrant issue is so important, because these are the most vulnerable populations in Libya. They were bombed during the long siege and attack on Tripoli. They are trafficked in the most atrocious ways. They are they deal with all different kinds of racism and degradation and humiliation at the hands of European governments who repatriate them to Libya, attacking forces, defending forces, pushed back to their countries. When I was living in Libya in the 2000s, I knew a lot of these migrants of the pre-revolutionary crowd, and already things were bad. And where the revolution, they got much, much worse. And I tracked some of the friends of mine as they went back to the Sahel or back to the Horn of Africa or ended up in Europe or got pushed back again. And in many ways, the plight of these migrants is a sad commentary, not on militias or not, but on the international community in general, on Europe's approach to all of Africa and North Africa in particular, and how Libyans deal with their own guest populations. And as the proper reporting on this shows, everyone's guilty and everyone needs to take dramatic actions to improve how they deal with this population. With that, I'd like to introduce our first panelist. The way we're going to structure this is ask them to make some introductory remarks and answer an initial question. Then we're going to do a couple more rounds of questions, time permitting, and then open it up for audience questions. And if our U.S. government representative can join at an opportune point, I'm going to rely on Natasha and Fatima to let me know when that's been made possible. So our first panelist today is Mark Mcallist, and I hope I got the pronunciation correctly. He's director of the North Africa and Sahel Observatory at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, where he leads research on organized crime based on a field network of more than 180 monitors comprising local journalists, research, and academics established in Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, Southern Algeria, Niger, Chad, Mali, and Sudan. Some of my favorite countries. In fact, I'm teaching a new course at American University this spring on all of those countries, a Maghreb, Sahel, Horn class. I won't go further. He has an illustrious bio here and publications, and I'm sure we can make that available to you. The question, 2 questions for Mark to start is, first, your introductory remarks. In answer to the question, can you please discuss the specific challenges you and your organization face while researching transnational crime, human rights abuses, or providing assistance to refugees and migrants? If you want to mention COVID, please feel free. And then the directed question for you for this introductory round is, would you please share your observations about the link between detention centers, human trafficking, and smuggling networks? How do militias benefit from involvement in detention centers? Mark, the floor is yours.
I have 5 minutes for all that, right?
We'll give you 5.5.
Okay, I'll skip the introduction. So the Global Initiative, very, very quickly, is a very young organization, really, that set out to be a bit of a disruptor. So looked at the UN system, thought there was a lot of good, but felt that there wasn't a connection between sort of governments, law enforcement, and that sort of framework, and civil society. Both of these are needed for any solution, but very often tend not to communicate. And I'm using this introduction because I think it's useful also to sort of understand where I'm coming from and why I'm looking at the situation in the way I do. So also very brief background on myself also, so you know where I'm coming from. In my former incarnation as an investigative journalist, I covered Libya before the revolution, during the revolution, and after the revolution. And I have been researching human smuggling in particular in Libya since the turn of the century, since this phenomenon really caught anyone's attention. And that gives me the benefit of a historic perspective, which I think is necessary, because yes, the revolution is a very, very important determining point, which changed dynamics. But also there are very significant trends which ultimately have remained the same. In fact, in reality, if you really boil down, especially when we're looking at the predation of migrants, the exploitation of migrants, including what happens to them in detention centers, the basic premise or the basic narratives that come from migrant victims haven't changed really. It's very sad, but it hasn't changed. I've interviewed migrants back in 2005, 2006, who've given me very similar stories to migrants that I've interviewed in 2014. What has changed, and this is very important when it comes to your initial question, is first of all the scale of the system, the scale of the exploitation, and the extent of the predation. And that was, in its largest part, the result of the proliferation of militias after the revolution. So that is responsible, first of all, for the industrialization of human smuggling and trafficking in Libya. Without militias, there wouldn't have been the scale expansion that we saw post 2012, 2013. And it can be traced back to very specific turning points. And also, we wouldn't have seen the expansion in the capacity and logistics of the human smuggling industry. Now, one qualification, I would broadly agree with the initial classification on the categorization of militias, with one proviso, which is, yes, the number of purely criminal outfits that fall within the umbrella of militias in Libya are few. However, they are accompanied by a large majority of militias that many of them are actually quasi-official and now have assumed the role of a state function, which protect various types of criminal activities. And this leads me to the question of detention centers. The most problematic and most alarming element concerning the exploitation of migrants in detention center, and the most pernicious, relates to this, which is the fact that, especially after 2017, when association of militias with human smuggling became rather toxic, and a number of militias actively retreated from the direct involvement in putting people on boats, to be clear, many of them switched to a law enforcement aura related to human smuggling, and started capitalizing on their involvement in the migration management business. And detention centers are a very, very important locus in this. So a militia running a detention center or protecting a detention center, and there are several of these, in the process, overseeing a system where migrants are routinely asked for ransoms, routinely sort of loaned into the industry, made to work for little or no money actually, and all of these proceeds going back to militias, many of which, as I said, now have a state function and actually are either part of the Ministry of Interior, part of the Ministry of Defense, so on and so forth. And this is important to highlight, because this is part and parcel of the political discussion. And in a further sort of outlook into 2022, whether or not the elections are held or not, when a stable government is in place that has the legitimacy required to operate in the international setting, this definitely should be one of the priorities to be tackled going forward, and which really and truly is enmeshed in broader problems that Libya has with the role of armed groups and their intersection with the state. I think I'll stop there. I don't know if I answered.
Thank you, Mark, for very enlightened opening comments. let me say in response that the name of the article that I'd forgotten the title of is called Libya's Forgotten Peacekeepers. And my point was, among others in the article and in my introductory remark, is that it was militias that were defending the US mission in Benghazi that tried to rescue and revive Chris Stevens against jihadist militias that were attacking. So we have to kind of understand, and I totally agree with your point, Mark, that of the 80% of what we might call the revolutionary militias with best intentions, there's been a lot of slippage towards predation. The point I was trying to make there is that in an apocalyptic year like 2019, if you're in a detention center in Tripoli getting bombed, who are you being subjected to horrific conditions by? The militia detaining you, or the militia bombing you? And my contention would be both militias, rather than the militias of the West. That was sort of my point. Great opening comments. I'm going to move on to Thomas Garofalo, who is the International Rescue Committee's Libya country director, and has experience directing programs in diverse humanitarian and development contexts across Latin America, Europe, and the Middle East. His organization, the IRC, has been present in Libya since 2016, where they provide life-saving health and protection services, support wider health system strengthening efforts, and are building the capacity of Libyan youth in peace building and governance initiatives. And for your introductory remarks, I'd like you to answer that same first question about discussing the specific challenges you and your organization face while researching transnational crime, investigating human rights abuses, or providing assistance to refugees and migrants. And then your directed question, first question, would you tell us about the conditions faced by migrants and refugees at disembarkation points and inside detention centers, and what IRC is doing to support them? Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bill. And I want to thank the Alliance as well, the Libyan American Alliance. It's really, it's good to be a part of this panel. And I look forward to reading your report. It seems extremely timely. As you said, William, the IRC is an international humanitarian agency and crisis response organization. And we work in about 40 countries, really along the whole arc of the crisis, because we work in many countries in conflict or recovering from conflict, but we are also very involved as partners of the US government and other governments in the resettlement enterprise, bringing people from situations of conflict who have been granted asylum and refugee status to make new lives in other countries. So really we're present along the entire span of the situation. And so today we're talking about Libya. We mentioned that we have history since 2016 of working in Libya, and only part of our work is with migrants and refugees and working with populations in detention. We started in Libya in 2016 as a very operational health response organization, and since have grown with the Ministry of Health, which in spite of the conflict and many challenges has continued to try and provide health services, public health services and other services to Libyan and non-Libyan populations, and in spite of everything has been able to continue forward. Today we're focusing on migrants and refugees, and it's very timely right now. In fact, I'm just getting WhatsApp messages from our teams who are working, responding to disembarkations of people who have been intercepted at sea and are being returned by the Libyan Coast Guard right now. There's two happening simultaneously, which is not unusual, and that points to one of the many challenges that we face, that the sheer pace of returns has been very high. We also work in trying to support migrants and refugees to access healthcare and other services in the urban community, and the population in detention is very small. Right now it's only about 5,000 in official Libyan authority-run detention centers, but there's hundreds of thousands of non-Libyans who are present in Libya. Many of them have just come to live. Libya has often been a destination country of people who have been on the move, fleeing conflicts or fleeing economic privations, now fleeing climate change, and come to Libya. And then once they're in Libya, and they face the predation and other hardships that come with a lack of a legal framework and lack of status. They frequently decide to try and flee to Europe. So this year, we've seen a vast increase in the number of people who are trying to take to the Mediterranean Sea and that very dangerous passage to flee to Europe. In the entire year of 2020, there were there were 11,900 or so people who tried this dangerous path. In 2021, we've seen about 31,000. So it's a vast increase. Part of the increase is because for much of 2020, there was a war going on that disrupted some of this flow of people. But it also proves that in spite of COVID, in spite of...
Just to qualify, just a quick fact check. Is that the highest ever, or have there been worse years, that 31,000 level?
You know, I might defer to Mark. I think that's pretty much, there may have been higher numbers before, but certainly since I've been here in 2018, that's the highest that we've seen.
Thank you.
So that means that we've had, because we are responding to these disembarkations in 4 sites, but really only 2 that are very heavily trafficked in Tripoli. And we have responded to about 175 disembarkations in this year so far. The year's not quite over. A mix of nationalities. There are about 40 different nationalities of migrants and refugees who are present in Libya. So people from all over the world, from Bangladesh to Mali and to Eritrea and Ethiopia, Syria, Sudan, many from Sudan. That's probably the highest population is Sudanese. So the sheer number is certainly a challenge. They are suffering in so many different ways. When they're returned by the Libyan Coast Guard, they usually are intoxicated from the fuel, the fumes of the fuel. They may be suffering from cold. They are always traumatized, not just from the ordeal at sea, but often from suffering from rape and extortion and violence all along the way, before Libya, in Libya, and when they're intercepted as well. And then they're brought. We have a very short window to do some medical referrals and treat them. And then they're sent to a sort of a processing center and then farmed out to a variety of detention centers that are run by the DCIM that you mentioned. There's no systematic registration of these people. So they frequently, we lose track of them. Sometimes we see them once we are able to go to detention centers to provide assistance there. But that's one of the challenges we have. And the other big challenge is that so many of them disappear. I mentioned that 31,000 were returned. We were able to assist about 23,000 of those, but yet there's fewer than 5,000 of them in detention. And so the question that's obvious is where do they go? What happens to them? What's their status? And there are many different ways where they can leave detention. Mark, you know, we rely so much on the analysis that his organization is doing, and they've been a really important voice in this discussion here. And he points out the ways that they can buy their way out. Some escape, but they are ransomed, as Ian has talked about in his article. So it's difficult. And I think that points to the other point I wanted to make, is that while there is no legal framework and there's no status for these people, there doesn't seem to be a way out of this right now. And so for our staff, I'm concerned about them, because really it's kind of hopeless that they see these populations return to Libya. Often they lose everything in that attempt because it costs money, and they're so vulnerable to extortion, and then they have no choice but to try again, you know. And I didn't mention the numbers of people who have died. 1,300 people in 2021 alone were lost at sea. So yeah, I mean, those are some of the challenges that we see. Perhaps I can leave it there. I don't know if I answered the second question, but I'm happy to try again.
Yeah, you're good for now. And I knew this wasn't going to be a happy panel, but the scale of what we're talking about is just devastating to hear about. And thank you for portraying it so so helpfully for our audience. I'm going to move on to Ian Urbina now, and Ian is place, and now I found him. He's an investigative reporter who I first saw on MSNBC quite recently. Based in Washington. His most recent series, The Outlaw Ocean, chronicles a diversity of crimes offshore, including the killing of stowaways, sea slavery, international dumping, illegal fishing, the stealing of ships, gun running, stranding of crews, and murder with impunity. He's reported from Africa, Asia, Europe, South America, and the Middle East. Much of that time spent on fishing ships. Mr. Urbina has also written extensively on criminal justice issues, including stories about the use of prisoners for pharmaceutical experiments, immigrant detainees working on paid solitary confinement in immigration detention facilities, and the dependence of the U.S. Defense Department on prison labor. I'll leave the rest of his bio for discovery later. I'm sure we can make it available. Ian, I'm going to start with one of the same questions and then a directed question at you. Can you please discuss the specific challenges you faced while researching transnational crime, investigating human rights abuses, and providing assistance to refugees and migrants? And for you, in developing your article, The Secretive Prisons That Keep Migrants Out of Europe, is there a specific story or movement that sticks out to you?
Yeah, so just some context. So as you mentioned, the reporting I do is now based at a nonprofit called the Outlaw Ocean Project, which is a sort of ProPublica style news organization. The reason I'm on this panel is because of a story 2 weeks ago published in the New Yorker that looked at the migration challenge in Libya and detention facilities. To your specific question, I would say, you know, I took a team to Libya to report on this story. This was the second stint on this overall topic. I had done a piece previously for The Atlantic about the Italian government's leasing of 7 large cruise ships to house 10,000 migrants offshore, ostensibly to quarantine them, but also additionally to vet them and decide what to do with them and to keep them away from reporters and advocates and the like. In reporting on that story and getting on those vessels, the harrowing tales that everyone here already knows about what was happening in Libya sort of decided for me what the next investigation should be. So in May, I took a team of 4 of us to Libya to take a look specifically at one facility, Al Mabani, which means the buildings, which is the newest and largest and most notorious of the official detention facilities, and a specific murder that occurred in that facility, to some degree meant to be synecdoche of a larger tale of the kind of quintessential climate migrant and how they sometimes end up in these facilities. The other question, Dr. Lawrence, that you raised, I might jump to because it's more interesting, but to answer your first question, we were taken captive by a militia and disappeared into a prison and held for quite some time and pretty severely abused. So clearly of moments that I remember acutely, that part of our reporting effort will stick with me forever. Truth be told, I don't like to discuss it a lot because what happened to us and my team pales in comparison to what's happening routinely to hundreds and thousands of migrants in Libya who are disappeared and treated far worse than we were, and many of them don't make it out. So certainly our captivity was the moment in our reporting that stuck with me most.
Thank you, Ian. I'm going to stick with you and just also mention quickly that my longtime friend, Anthony Shadid, was also taken prisoner in Libya and had a very similar position towards his imprisonment as you. It spoke, you know what I'm saying, in a sort of similar way about not wanting to talk about it, but it also being harrowing. I also should have mentioned that you have a Pulitzer and a Polk and hopefully our audience viewing you today can say, I knew you before you got the next award for this tremendous feat of reporting that you did in the New Yorker. And I'm hoping, if it hasn't already been done, that Natasha or Fatima can put a link to the article in the chat. The second directed question for you, Ian, because you have to leave early, and I'll ask Ahmed to bear with me while I help him because he has to leave early. How can Europe be incentivized to shift their involvement in the migrant and refugee crisis to actually protect migrants and refugees?
It's a really good question. And let me just say a couple things. One, Anthony Shadid was an editor of mine before I joined the New York Times 20 years ago. I worked on the Middle East, and Anthony Shadid was on the board of the directors at the think tank where I was based. He's an amazing journalist. He was an amazing journalist, much as you know, Bill. I also just want to say a quick thanks to Mark and Tom, who were amazing guides and tutors in the reporting, sort of helping me make sure I get it right when I reported this piece for the New Yorker. I want to sort of publicly thank them for all that. With regard to your question, I think there are multiple layers, and they might feel like a hodgepodge list. My outlook here on things that could change are differing in altitude. One is, I do think that the rhetoric that presently exists and fogs the space a bit, obscures the reality, needs to be confronted. So things like the reference to what's happening on the Mediterranean and the EU role, and referring to those as rescues as opposed to arrests, is a fundamental problem in the overall public understanding. These are arrests. Most of these are occurring in international waters. They're occurring against the will of migrants. They are picking up people and taking them back to a place that has been officially designated not a port of safety. These are not rescues. And so I think we all as a public need to really think clearly and soberly about that. I think furthermore, there is a sleight of hand, a rhetorical sleight of hand that I think certain folks in the EU have used for far too long in referencing the EU role on the Mediterranean and with regard to the abuses in the migration centers, which is to say, we in the EU, don't build, we don't arm, we don't uniform those guards at the detention centers. That's not our deal. Look to the Libyan government, it's their fault. And really what's happening there is terrible, but we can't do anything about it. I think that's really disingenuous. And I think more aggressive confronting of that rhetoric and saying, yes, but the raison d'etre of the migration centers is the very return policy that you've enabled through the Libyan Coast Guard. Those wouldn't exist. Surely they existed under Gaddafi, and they were not pleasant places then. There's always been those, but the filling of them is an EU creation, and the EU is very involved with everything around them, from the tablets to counting the migrants to the buses that carry them to the detention centers, and in so many other ways that we found. So I think that's the other thing. But there's a laundry list of other key ways in which EU policy could change, and some of them are already in motion. Litigation against Frontex. Frontex puts the drones and planes over the Mediterranean, providing the coordinates to member states, Italy, Malta, that then often gets handed off the Libyan Coast Guard. Libyan Coast Guard then goes and picks them up. If there wasn't that intel, the return policy would not be half as deadly and effective. And that's a EU creation. The weaponization of port administration, Doctors Without Borders and other ships that are actually doing true humanitarian rescues have a very harrowing time trying to do their work because of the way that ports on the European side handle them when they come back to shore. And that's a decided policy, and that could easily change. So these are just a couple of the examples. I mean, the IMO, for example, approved the change in status of Libyan search and rescue zone and expanded its realm, which has given cover to the Libyan Coast Guard to say, back off, even though we're in international waters, back off, Doctors Without Borders. These are, we have jurisdiction here. And if you get in our way, bad things will happen. We'll open fire. We're very aggressive moves. They're outside of their national waters, and they're invoking jurisdiction that has been sort of handed to them by the UN, by the International Maritime Organization, that should have never been handed to them. So these are all ways in which, if key players in Europe wanted to try to disrupt the current really abusive and efficient system of return to Libyan detention centers. These are just some of them that could be employed. And to your question before about statistics, 2015 saw 500,000 refugees and migrants cross the Mediterranean. So these numbers have been quite large in recent years, much larger than they are now in terms of overall flow.
Thank you, because I thought that was the case, but I said 2016, so thank you for being specific on that. I'm sure most of our panelists could have answered that question, but let me give you one more, Ian. Sorry, it was something I wanted to say. Oh, I just said calling the Libyan Coast Guard a Coast Guard, and I've been doing a recent project with the US Coast Guard. It's just not the right term. I think if we had a term that meant militia and Coast Guard, and the negative definition of militia, using for some of the militias in my introductory remarks, then we have a word closer to what the Libyan Coast Guard is. The last question to Ian, and I hope, Ian, you can stay as long as you can to listen to Ahmed. US and the international community do to protect these vulnerable populations and hold those facilitating the cycle of violence accountable?
Look, I often say reporters don't know anything. They just know people that know things. And two of them are on this call, Mark and Tom. And so I turn to my tutors in moments like this and say, what do you think? What is the appropriate answer here? Smart people I talk to on this tough question, and it is a tough question, say two things that I regurgitate. One is a bit more ambitious and big picture, and the other is a bit more applied and perhaps real world. My sense is the real world, one real world more immediate way to potentially reduce harm in these detention facilities might be to squeeze, for the EU, to squeeze pressure on the Libyan Coast Guard and that revenue stream as a method to get the Libyan government to pay attention to the serious concerns about what's happening on land to these migrants when they're returned. I'm not sure, again, as counseled by sources, that the EU has as much leverage over the militias and the federal authorities, DCIM, that run the detention centers. Tom and others are working hard to do harm reduction in those facilities. But in terms of really cleaning them up and getting more eyes in there, I think the pressure that could be applied probably goes through the Libyan Coast Guard. So that's one thing I've heard that sounds convincing. The other thing is a bit more meta and may sound quixotic or idealistic and implausible, but I do think if you're looking at a global stampede like climate migration, and you're looking at 150 million people over the next 50 years having to relocate, and you're looking at how this problem is going to increase, and you're thinking that your solution, whether it's the US government on the Mexican border, funneling money there to sort of southernize our border and stop migrants from reaching the US border, or the EU via Italy in Libya, outsourcing your policing of migration to failed states is a terrible idea. And dedicating so much of your funding towards symptoms rather than causes, more guys with guns, more SUVs in the deserts, more patrol vessels, rather than trying to look more at the push factors in Guinea-Bissau, like our main character, that are causing a lot of these folks to head to Libya. Again, that sounds pie in the sky and easy for me to say, but I do think we probably have to think at that altitude if we're going to really try to get to root causes of so many people traveling.
Well, I'd like to thank the rest of the panel for watching me because of Ian's schedule with giving him some extra time here, and for being excellent teachers. And I'd like to congratulate Ian for being an excellent student and an excellent communicator of the horrific context and conditions that so many thousands of victims are going through. I'd like to turn to Ahmed. Ahmed El Gasir is a dedicated human rights and environment activist. He co-founded Human Rights Solidarity, HRS, in December 1999 in Switzerland. He's currently a senior human rights researcher and program planner at HRS. He's represented at several international human rights events, including side events at the meeting of Assembly of States Parties to the Rome Status of the International Criminal Court, ICC, in October 2014 at the UN quarters in New York, and at a workshop organized by ICC and about the role of ICC in supporting the capacity of the national judiciary in Libya. I will turn to Ahmed without reading the rest of his long bio and his excellent publications, which I hope LA can make available to those interested. Same opening question to you, Ahmed. What are the specific challenges you and your organization face while researching everything we're talking about? And a directed question for you, Ahmed. Since you work directly with migrants and refugees on the ground in Libya, can you tell us about what's happening with the UNHCR sit-ins?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Ian for his excellent article. Timely, came in really in a good time. Our organization, we've been working as a human rights organization. We've been working on the issue of the refugees since 2016. Specifically, we started doing field visits to the detention centers, where our associates, they go there, visit and sit with the detainees, listen, check on their situation and so on, and then we report to the UN mechanisms, cases like, for example, cases of very vulnerable people that they need attention because of their situation, especially the sick or the women, young mothers with babies that they don't have any medical assistance or food for their babies. They don't provide them in the detention centers, by the way. It's they either provide for themselves or some humanitarian organization comes up and do that. But we've been reversing when we've seen it. The situation of the refugees in Libya is that they are in a country which is not party to the Convention for the Refugees, nor it is party to the protocol for the status of refugees, the 1966-67 protocol. And so there is no, in Libya, there is no legal, protections for the refugees recognizing their status. So they are there in a limbo completely. And they have no protection. Libyan legislation, they don't have, for example, a legislation for refugee status, for how to process them, how to grant them refugee status. There is nothing there. And what happened on these sittings outside the office of the what they call the community day center run by the UNHCR in Sarraj area, west of suburb of Tripoli, is that on the 1st of October, there were mass arrests targeting refugees, migrants in Tripoli, especially in the old city and in another district. Libyan authorities acknowledged 4,000 detained. The IOM reported 4,100 in something like a couple of days. They detained them, and then put all this group in a detention center, crowded, nothing there for a week. They were in a very bad situation. So some of them broke out. Hundreds of them actually broke out. We don't know exact number. That was on the 8th of October, 7 days after they've been arrested. And then on the 9th, they went in front of on the office of the UNHCR, trying to bring attention to their situation. What led to that is that the Libyan authorities suspended the evacuation flights that were run by the IOM to return what they call the voluntary return, humanitarian return flights, migrants who want to return to their countries. they stopped that, and also the flights that were organized by the UNHCR to relocate refugees to either a third country, safe countries, like they've been doing, relocating them to East Africa, to not Burundi, the other country, and then from there they will find, process them and to a third, final relocation country. That was suspended for more than a year before October, so they were stuck there without any. And in these people became in a hopeless situation, and now they are being since 8th of October until today. They are still sitting there. Their numbers are around from 700 to 1,500. They gathered there in the open. There is not a single organization, international organization. UNHCR closed its office in front of the doors, closed the door, did not want to accept them in, and no other organization is providing them with service. They are in the open air, and now the UNHCR last week announced to them that they will be closing the office, the CDC, it's called the Care Community Day Center. They will be closing it, and any humanitarian assistance will be provided through its partner organizations like the IOM or the other organizations that they help. The problem, another issue for the UNHCR is that it has only one office in Libya, and that's in Tripoli. It does not provide any support for refugees in other parts of Libya, and it provides only one number, telephone number for refugees to contact. And now, according to the UNHCR, there are something like 41,000 registered refugees there without any support. This is what led to this sit-ins, and I think on the 31st of December, their situation, because those who are camping outside, who lost their belongings in the raids, who have lost the wherever accommodation that they were sort of like sheltering in especially in Gargash, they will be they will have to be evicted, because the UNHCR will be handing over the premises, and then they will have, I don't know where they will go. Their situation in Libya is very bad. I mean, I'm not talking about the what goes on in the detention centers, which I will just remark that most of them are run by militias, even those that they are under the banner of the anti-illegal immigration authority. Most of them are run by militias. This is the situation of the refugees.
Thank you, Ahmed. I'm juggling a couple of things here, but I'd like to turn to Mark next. And if you have anything to respond to what was said by the others briefly, but I also have a directed question for you. What can be done to dismantle the lucrative trade of trafficking and smuggling of refugees and migrants in Libya?
Dismantling completely is impossible, and I think that's a very important policy standpoint to start from. Disrupting and undermining is possible and has been done, not perfectly, but has been done. So there have been various interventions across North Africa and even the Aegean that have damaged human smuggling networks. And this in some sense also ties into what you were saying about the good militias and the bad militias. Militias are a reality in Libya, and it's a reality that's going to stay there for the foreseeable future. Like we need to project 10, 15 years into the future, and probably militias in some shape or form will still be part of the Libyan landscape. The cat is out of the bag, and I don't think we're in a position to put it back in at this stage. So any sort of policy formulation needs to account for this. Now, what happened in the past years is illustrative of this as well. So one thing to bear in mind is when we're talking about figures, in 2016, between 2015 and 2017, numbers were on a completely different level. So yes, 2021 was an extremely busy year with 57,000 departures from Libya. That pales in comparison with 2016, when 180,000 migrants left Libya. What happened in the interim was that the government of national accord at the time intervened to co-opt some militias that were directly involved in human smuggling, and a few of them changed hats and turned from smugglers to law enforcement overnight. This is not perfect, so I'm not advocating for this model, that this model be taken over across all of Libya. Wasn't perfect because it provoked a war. So in Sabratha there was a war that was precisely triggered by these events, and some of these militias, basically the message through them was a message of impunity, basically. That said, considering that militias aren't going to go anywhere anytime soon, this is one of the sort of broad models that needs to be considered. How are you going to incentivize militias to move away from monetizing the exploitation of migrants and into other areas? Okay, and when you get into this mindset, we can explore a lot of different ideas in practice. However, I think the most pressing objective for the international community vis-a-vis Libya is to come together and agree on some form of charter, because I feel that fundamentally, and this doesn't just apply to smuggling and trafficking, this applies to everything. The biggest problem in respect to Libya right now is that the international community is too fragmented. There are too many different players trying to extract too many different objectives in Libya, some of them to the benefit of sort of the Libyan polity as a whole, some of them to the detriment of the Libyan polity. And unless, and all of this is happening in the absence of a sort of leadership role by the European Union or the United States, or any other player that sort of has an engagement with Libya. Considering where Libya is at right now, where it is fragmented and where each different player has, literally an armed group backing it, unless there is a coherent strategy to tackle Libya's political future, progress is always going to be slow. And tackling human smuggling and trafficking is so far down in the list of priorities of what Libya needs to be tackling immediately that that's going to be even slower.
Thank you so much, Mark. I understand that our first guest speaker, John Pannell, has joined us and been promoted to panelist. And if he's unmuted, I'd like to invite him to give up to 5 minutes of remarks on today's topic.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much. And I do sincerely apologize for being late. We're actually at a very interesting time right now in Libya. I think everyone is aware, tracking, the lead up to elections and how that whole process is unfolding. We also have a number of visitors at the same time, so things are quite busy at the moment, but I think overall that's a very good sign. I have been able to hear the panelists so far, And I think we're lucky to have a number of experts who provided very, very good insights, and we're familiar with a number of them already. I'm the Usaid country director for Libya. And although Usaid does not support efforts to migrants specifically, our State Department Population, Refugees, and Migration Bureau counterparts do. And we do work very closely in coordination with them on broader humanitarian assistance that focuses not only on migrants, but also refugees and internally displaced persons. And so we recognize this issue is extremely important for the folks involved in today's call, but also for the broader international community, including the United States. So I'm really happy to be on this call. With that, not to repeat necessarily what others have said, but just a couple of background points, and then I can talk a little bit more about kind of the US government perspective as well. So as we all know, and it has been stated already, globally, more broadly speaking, beyond just Libya, irregular migration is a global phenomenon with very horrific human costs. It requires a comprehensive social, economic, and security response. And in the Libya context, we strongly believe that only a unified central government that's capable of controlling its borders, in accordance, of course, with human rights and international humanitarian law, can begin to address this very important task. And of course, in cooperation with relevant international organizations and partners, a number of whom we've already heard from previously on the panel. And so for us, as I mentioned, a lot of focus on upcoming elections. We do believe that these elections offer the only path to establishing a legitimate Libyan government that is capable of playing this role that I just described regarding migrants. We also stand, of course, very much ready to support the Libyan government in creating an appropriate migration governance system. Now, specifically, moving on to what the US does and can do, we obviously support continued protection and assistance to refugees and asylum seekers in Libya, in addition to regional coordination and training the Libyan government to address irregular migration flows in accordance, of course, with human rights principles and international humanitarian law, as I mentioned at the outset. US assistance to migrants is designed to abide by the do no harm principle approach, if you will. So we only fund activities that are strictly necessary, ensuring that our assistance does not support current detention structures or detaining authorities and militias. US partners provide reception and registration services for refugees and asylum seekers, distribute essential relief items and cash assistance as well. They also provide equipment and infrastructure support to local healthcare facilities, implement livelihoods and food security programs, and deliver other assistance items to affected populations. Just a couple other quick points as well. So we also support longer-term migration governance objectives, so including building the capacity of human rights defenders, judicial sector actors, training on human rights best practices, and helping Libya create resilient laws that are in line with international humanitarian law commitments. We also advocate that Libyan authorities afford UNHCR and IOM with greater access to migrants and refugees both inside and outside detention centers in order to allow them to deliver critical protection services and life-saving assistance to these vulnerable individuals. Again, I just wanted to thank you all for having me on the panel, and I do sincerely apologize for being late, but I have had an opportunity to hear from the other panelists. And like I said, there is a lot of expertise on this call. And so I look forward to hearing more during the rest of the call as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. That's really important perspective to have. And I like how it meshed well with how the panel is going. And thank you for your service. And to everyone who works on this issue. It's just really important work. Next, I would like to tell the audience that we're going to go maybe 20 minutes over to cover every question we can. I'd like to turn to Thomas Garofalo next with a directed question. What are the challenges of providing humanitarian assistance in detention centers and disembarkation points?
Well, I outlined a few of them a little bit earlier, just the logistics of providing help to people that are in such a vulnerable state. I think that's that's the main thing. But I think it was Dr. El Gasir who talked a bit about the crackdown in October, which was extremely challenging for the people that we try to serve among the migrant and refugee population. So many of the people who were swept up in this crackdown were people that we were providing assistance to and working with. We have a number of community volunteers that we rely on to pass information out to the different communities that are at risk from the other nationalities that I mentioned earlier. And many of them were actually swept up and arrested in quite a brutal and violent way and thrown into detention centers. We had a young man who, he and his wife and a newborn baby were detained in a situation where there were so many people that they couldn't lie down, that there weren't regular access to toilet facilities, so there was urine on the floor. They were cold. The weather was getting cold and rainy. And 4 other community outreach personnel that we work with were also detained. And the last one of those, we only succeeded in having released somewhat recently. So, you know, I think that it's important also, I mean, we're talking about the systemic issue. What we have tried to advocate for as the International Rescue Committee are things that are not easy by any means, but perhaps could be a way to have some sort of improvement in the situation. And one of them that is, we think, absolutely critical is that there really has to be a return to a European search and rescue in the Mediterranean. It's clear from the other speakers that the Libyan Coast Guard is not capable and has other limitations and is not really able to protect in any way the lives or the welfare of these people that are trying to cross the Mediterranean. It's really important that the European Union reestablishes that kind of capacity. I think Mark had mentioned this, that had existed earlier. And then on the ground, I mean, the narrative around the crackdown was that this was an anti-crime venture, that there were criminals, drug traffickers, etc., that were being arrested. Our experience does not reflect that in the least. Most of the people are simply working, they're part of the economy. Libya, like so many other countries, relies on this population for, you know, construction, agriculture, retail support, and there is a place for them in the Libyan economy, and it should be possible to free them from the detention centers under some sort of a work permit scheme, and this is something that has been done in other countries, and frankly, UNHCR has tried to do that and tried to negotiate that with the Libyan authorities. And UNHCR, we have to recognize, is really in a difficult position because of the things that Dr. El Gasir was talking about. They don't have official status as a UN agency in Libya, and so they struggle really to provide services. And the fact is, we need more destinations for people who are asylum seekers in Libya to go. There are very few places for them to go, and all countries, not just European countries, although they certainly bear the most responsibility because of the geography, but the United States as well. It's really good to see that the US government has increased the number of places for resettlement and for other pathways, but the numbers aren't sufficient to the people that are in need by any means, and there's something has to be done to change that math, basically, and to allow that, including the repatriation flights that were mentioned and the resettlement flights. We also manage a small shelter in Misrata for people who have been cleared to leave Libya to have new lives in other countries, and the numbers are extremely small. There are a couple of dozen people. There are thousands of people that need this kind of relief, and there's no way for them to get it until there are more options for resettlement.
Thank you so much. And one question for Ahmed Gasir. How can Libyan authorities, UN bodies, and international community address the lack of timely or transparent registration and review process of detainees?
Just a remark on what Thomas just said.
Please.
I mean, it's not a criticism for UNHCR. UNHCR in a bad situation because they are not recognized in Libya, and until there is something that's the Libyan authority settle and at least get an agreement, memorandum of agreement that's so that they will become, for example, one of the issues is that registered refugees, that they should be, when they have this letter or this identification document that they are a registered refugee, that at least they are not arrested, harassed, allowed, and some kind of legal status. This is important for it. We understand that the Libyan authority have to control the presence of expats, of non-nationals in its territory. Every country must, document people who are residing. We understand that. We understand that the Europeans are trying to limit the flow of refugees to their territories. But at least, they have to also, but at least they have to respect international law. Don't return people to a country that is not safe for them. Don't support organizations that are not, that there are what do you call evidence or suspicions that they are involved. For example, the head of the Libyan Coast Guard in Zawiya, Al-Bija. I mean, this guy is on the sanctions list of the United Nations, and still he's operating running a detention center where people who are intercepted in the sea, they are returned to his center. Now, him and his associates. Last month, one Syrian refugee, among others, who were returned to a Zawiya center, Shuhada Nasr, they were beaten. One of them was beaten on his head with a rod that killed him. And when his family, his siblings, tried to ask for the body to give them, they refused. And we don't know what happened to the body, buried in an unmarked grave or something. So for the Europeans, we understand that they don't need, they want to control the flow through here. But at least since you are a signatory to the convention and its protocol, you have to respect the law, and you have to find a way of dealing with this situation, and it is a priority because fighting this human trafficking, these militias, they get money from trafficking the persons. When they were released, somebody is not only released until they pay a ransom or a bribe to be released. That's where the numbers, Thomas, that they are disappearing because they are really, they buy their way out. Many of them. That's one thing. The other thing is that for every number they report is detained, they get a budget from the authority. Budget for supposedly that they are catering and providing guards and whatever services, which is it. So the longer this goes on, the stronger these gangs, these militias get stronger, and it makes complications, and it will hit back. This dirty money will hit us back. So it is a priority to fight it for everybody, for the sake of everybody. So the UNHCR and Libyan authorities have to come to agreement with the UNHCR, and also maybe the United States can help in that it is respected. And it is not everybody, by the way, not every migrants in Libya are coming to Libya to go to Europe. I mean, the biggest community in Libya, expats in Libya, migrants, are from Niger. I think they're something like 150,000 according to the IOM. And when you look at the numbers of arrivals by sea in Italy, which is the main sort of like destination for people embarking on boats to shore, you don't find people from Niger Niger nationalities there. You don't find them. I haven't seen any numbers of them. They are very, very low among sort of like others. Most of the people from Niger, they come and work in Libya. So find a way of helping these people. The biggest number of people who arrive in Italy are Tunisians. Some of them, they leave from Tunisia directly. Some of them live from Libya. The second nationality this year, it's Bangladeshi. And they arrive in Libya legally. They don't cross borders. They don't walk across the borders. They arrive in Libya, and we are investigating this. They arrive in Libya legally through some sort of like what they call employment companies. They come with an employment visa. They arrive in Libya. Some of them remain in Libya and work, but many of them go by sea. If you check the numbers of the arrivals in Italy by sea, you'll find the second biggest nationality is Bangladeshi. And then you have the Egyptians, and then you have Syrians. This year we have seen a large number of Syrians arriving. Also, they arrive in Libya legally. They arrive in Libya with what they call security clearance. They arrive via Benina Airport. There are, I think, a couple of flights by Sham Air Wings every week. They arrive. We are investigating this as well. So,
can I jump in with questions or not yet?
This is what I'm saying. I mean, we understand all the constraints every country has, every party has its own sort of like needs to do, but you have to also respect the needs and the life of these people. And it is a priority now, because one thing is that these are human beings that they are suffering. The other is that these organized gangs that they are, I don't know, something like 5 billion according to the Europol. For I think in 2016 it was like 5 billion euros they made just by transporting people across the Mediterranean. That this money goes back into criminal activity. Sorry, Lawrence, I interrupted you.
I know, well, I appreciate that the panelists are answering the audience questions sort of as we go, but I'm going to try to get to some audience questions now. We're going to go a little over, maybe not the full 20 minutes, but I'm going to try to get to as many audience questions as I can. I would like to thank the audience people who are putting comments in the chat and in the Q&A, and I recommend that everybody take a look at the comments in the chat and the Q&A, because we're not going to turn those around as questions, but there's a lot of great information and eyewitness accounts of things going on there. I'd like to just turn it briefly to Ramadan, who's asked to ask a question, and ask him to ask one brief question and direct it, his best question, to a panel member. Ramadan? Is he there?
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, one question to a panel member, please.
Okay, well, thank you very much to the panel and for the Libyan American Alliance for this conference. I have a comment, and then I just want to hear your comment. My 86-year-old father-in-law lives with me. He has heart problems and health issues. And I wouldn't think to go in and say, hey, how come you didn't plow the snow or do the yard today? Libya has been struggling for 11 years with very unstable government. My father-in-law, I'm talking about, got kidnapped for over 2 weeks. People are getting kidnapped for ransoms. I lost 3 of my relatives. 2 of my nephews were injured. These are facts. Libya is a very unstable country. And when you have unstable country, you know these kind of criminal activities are going to occur. So my comment is, unless Libya is stabilized, and unless the international community help Libya stabilized, I don't really foresee helping these refugees. And unfortunately, it is a very sad situation, really, truly sad, and a horrible situation. But also Libyans are suffering from within by their own people. My doctor told me, you listen, when you get on a plane, what do they tell you about if there's an emergency? When the masks come down, you put your mask, your own mask first, then you try to help your kids and others. So unless we are in a good condition, unless we are stabilized, I don't see who's going to help those poor refugees who come to Libya knowing that Libya is a mess. So I just would like to hear that, please. Your comments is very wonderful.
Ray, I'd like to thank you for a very important, heartfelt comment, and add to the comment that we're all in the same boat. That's my response. The metaphor won't be lost on you. And I'll invite the panelists afterwards to comment on your comment if they'd like. Ismail, could I ask you to ask a question to a panelist?
Hi, Bill. Nice to see everyone. Thank you for this insightful event to those involved with it. So my question is pretty much in line really with this Mr. Ramadan just stated. You know, I'm looking at my bird home, and I'm seeing basically a state who basically scores high in the fragility index and practically a failed state. So, you know, despite that, the international community seems to be forcing the nations into basically a baseless or foundationless elections with no constitution, no roadmap, no security on the ground, no rule of law to basically make sure that the elections have any form of transparencies or honesty or that is one angle. On the other side, we all know and mindful that coming years is going to bring economic, basically refugees, ramifications of rising temperatures, climate, basically refugees who are going to go through any failed state. So we see Libya, this future, giving the lack of foundation for its election as really kind of unresolvable, more like a perpetual problems moving forward towards Europe. So my question is, what are the European policies? What are the roles of just the West in general? What are the policies in place to basically look forward a little bit ahead and consider the climate crisis and maybe do something in the meantime? Because as Mr. Ramadan said, Libya is a failed state. What are the community are going to do policy-wise to try to mitigate this issue? Thank you.
Thank you, Ismail. I'm going to bring in some more questions from the audience from the Q&A. The first one is from Yambio David Oliver, a survivor. What does Thomas Garofalo mean when he says there seems to be no way out for the migrants trapped in Libya? Are Italy and EU member states not responsible for these? Are they not the ones funding the so-called Libyan Coast Guards and its militias? Skipping over some comments. I saw another question here. Yes, about 900 of us have stayed in Libya for 5 years, but instead of giving us priority, this is from Feven Seltin, instead of giving us priority, they give us attention to those that stay 2 to 3 months for the process. What is our verdict, and why is it that we all can't leave at the same time or leave on a first come, first served basis? Another comment for the whole panel, and you can choose which ones you respond to. There are some refugees who already had their interviews, but didn't receive any info about their status for 2 years. And there are those who have been rejected. What kinds of solutions do we expect for these refugees? I'd like to go in the same order as before and invite Mark to address any of the questions and comments.
I'd like to say I agree, especially with there were a couple of comments concerning the condition of Libya right now and what can be expected of Libya, and also in the context of the ridiculous international pressure to hold these elections on the 24th of December. Or any time in the next couple of months, unless the conditions that were mentioned are met. it's clear that elections are going to be harmful for Libya and not positive. And I go back to the comment I made. In the current state Libya is in, with so many armed and empowered armed actors that are frankly holding much of the Libyan population up to ransom, basically. Yes, it is up to the international community to intervene, but intervene with a coherent plan, which currently doesn't exist. And where it exists, it's fickle. And the example of how the international community has been, or part of the international community has been pressing irrationally for these elections without first ensuring the really basic conditions that have been mentioned, a sound constitution that has buy-in, stability on the ground, and a situation where an election result can be defended if it needs to be defended, and a process that everyone can have confidence in, and you know, a role that everyone can have confidence in. Before these conditions are met, I agree obviously that an election is important, but before these conditions are met, having an election in these conditions will do more harm than good. And these are the basics that need to be tackled. Everything else comes later. The political question is always the fundamental question in Libya's current situation.
Thank you so much, Mark, for those cogent and thoughtful comments. Before I turn to Thomas, I'm going to ask the last question that's a question in the Q&A for the remaining panelists. And the rest are comments. I again encourage the group to look at them. My question is, how can we enhance and push the international community initiatives towards these countries, including Libya as well, for more economic startups, and also scale up the communications at all levels of the smuggling misdemeanor/crime, that all national and international laws are addressing it as a crime? And I'll turn to Thomas to address any of the comments and questions from the audience.
Thank you. I mean, the questions are really excellent. And just to pick up on what Mark was saying, many people say that Libya is a failed state. We hear that more and more frequently. Other people identify Libya as a middle-income country with enormous wealth and potential, and both are right. And this is the challenge. Without a bedrock of law and without unifying the country through governance measures, it's hard to see how things can progress. And I'm not a political expert, and I don't tend to talk about the political side in Libya. We're a humanitarian agency. But the level of attention given to the process of elections hasn't been as much as it has been on the deadline of the 24th of December. And it's really clear that we're running into reality now, where we're likely not going to see elections. I would say that I'm a humanitarian, and we have to have hope. What we have seen in working with the Ministry of Health is a tremendous willingness to be accepting and welcoming of non-Libyans. Not in every place, not uniformly, but like in any country, there are strong points that really need to be supported and built out. We have been working on public health system strengthening now for a couple of years, and this funding is coming from the European Union. And the point of the funding is to be able to support the public health system to address public health emergencies and primary health care, as well as secondary and tertiary. And this is an issue you can't put borders around. You can't say that you will only do public health for Libyans. And what we have found in working with Libyan health institutions is that they are very willing to make sure that everyone is covered by public health in Libya. And that's something that doesn't get a lot of attention out of the country. We talk a great deal about conflict in Libya, and that's accurate. There is a conflict in Libya. That's why people refer to it as a failed state so often. But with sustained assistance, we can build on those strong points and expand from there. And I have found that the Libyans that we work with, as I'm sure Mark would agree, are enormously hospitable and hopeful about that. When I say that there's no way out, I agree with the questioner. There aren't enough places for people to find safety and peace. It's sad, but the fact is that not everyone who is seeking asylum will be granted asylum. And we have to face that hard fact too. That's why so many people elect to go back to their home country through these IOM flights, or they are qualified legally to go to these other transit mechanisms in Rwanda, I think in Niger. And we have to vastly ramp up these pathways. And that includes countries like the United States and European countries to vastly increase the number of people they're willing to accept, because this problem will get worse, as the other questioners were mentioning. The climate change issue is really driving a lot of the migration to Libya now, and that is not going to improve soon. So we have to build on the strong points in Libya. It's possible to do that. It needs investment. I would also say that it can't only be a developmental question, because that's where most of the funding coming to Libya is going now. But there remains a humanitarian dimension of this, including in Libyans who are still displaced. It's gotten much better in the last year because of peace in Libya, relative peace. But there needs to be flexible funding given to Libya. We need to support the Libyans to build these systems. They can't do it alone, and we have to be a good partner to them to resolve the issue of migration in Libya and help them to do that in more than just a punitive way.
Ahmed, I'd like to invite you to briefly address any of the comments that you would like to address, and then we're going to move to the conclusion.
Just like
sorry, comments and questions, particularly the questions.
I mean, you know, the situation in Libya, we recognize it. It's the political divisions, the militias, the proliferation of weapons, and all that situation. We recognize it, and we recognize as well that Libya is not the cause of migration. Libya is not the source of, I mean, up to now, it's not the source of migration. People find why it has increased the transit. Libya is a transit country because of the lawlessness, because of the breakdown of law and order, because of these gangs, these human trafficking networks, which are transnational. They find it an easy territory to operate through it. But we're not blaming Libya for this. I am a Libyan. And we're here today. We are meeting to discuss the situation of the migrants. If you want to talk, it is a priority to stabilize Libya, because then when you have a law enforcement, when you have a law and order, then you will control these gangs, and you will make it difficult for them to operate. But when we're talking here, the solution that Europe is finding is that to try to prevent them from crossing, and even in the process breaking its own obligations to international law by returning forcing them. This has worsened the situation for the Libyan government. Yes, it's not the sole responsibility for the increased number of migrants, but it's a problem. People are stranded there. For a year, they have blocked the flights, and we know why. And we called on them, we wrote to them, we wrote to the authorities, we say to them, investigate this and name the culprits. Yeah, but I mean, we know that the culprits is protected by militias. So they delayed it for a whole year, blocked the flights, and did not address this, and it created this situation. The other thing is that you can't generalize by just carrying out mass arrests. As I said, there are some people who are, not respecting the law and may engage in, or might have engaged in criminal activities, but they are the minority. At least how we see it on the ground, how our researchers on the ground see it there. So Libya is not the source, it's not the cause of the problem. Libya is a transit country. You have the source countries and you have the destination countries. They have to come together into an agreement how to solve this, at least for the transitional period until situation in Libya improves, what we can do on the humanitarian side. That is what needs to be addressed. It's not, throwing the problem on the Libyans and say you have to deal with it. I hope that I have made the point clear. It's not, we did not discuss the situation in Libya because we are talking about just one issue, the migrants. If you want to talk about the political situation, why that the breakdown and why this impasse and the political process that has worsened the situation in Libya since 2014. Instead of improving, it has going down. Yes, the last 2 years, since June, not last year actually, since June 2020, when the militias or forces of Haftar retreated, and where the attack on Tripoli was repelled, and they retreated, and there has been a sort of like a ceasefire. Yes, it has improved the situation. But is it ready for a political solution now, imposing and rushing into a what they call elections? I don't know. I mean, I don't see it that way. So I hope that it's be clear for the. When I say it's a priority, addressing the human trafficking, it doesn't mean that we have to stop everything and else and do it. But you can't also ignore it, because ignoring it is what's just increase in influence and size. This is a problem.
Well, I've come away from this panel believing we need a Berlin process for migrants in Libya, as well as a Berlin process. If you look up failed state, it's a failed state. Libya does not meet most of the criteria for a failed state. It's a divided state, not a failed state. But it's a completely failed state when it comes to the migration issue, as well evidenced by all the comments we had today. Often when people talk about, can you hear me? It said it was unstable, but am I clear? When about Libya, they talk about it as a tabula rasa starting in 2011, as if Libya had no institutions, as if Libya had nothing but the dictator, as if Libya had no problems that pre-existed. And if this panel has taught us anything, Libya had a lot institutionally and in terms of challenges prior to 2011, and then everything got worse. And if we've learned anything today, also, it's that the militias are going nowhere. There's no DDR, no S coming anytime soon. And we have to problematize and nuance our discussion of every governing structure and every institution in Libya, because it's not, but it's all failing. And the international community is failing the migrants and the Libyan people on a regular basis. I hope my friend Stephanie Williams can make some ground in the coming weeks, and the Libyan people can take things back a little bit in the coming weeks as well. I'd like to thank the panelists for the best discussion of Libyan migration I've seen on Libya, and I've participated in quite a few. And I'd like to turn things back over to Natasha and Fatima for a brief concluding remark on behalf of the Libyan American Alliance.
I'm sorry, we're a little over time, but I do want to say thank you so much to our incredible panel. It's been so amazing to have you here, and to our amazing moderator as well, and for your insight, Dr. Lawrence. We're really grateful for all of your time. I also want to thank the attendees for being here today with us. And we really hope to keep the momentum going on this issue, and we really hope to host more events and initiatives around this issue. So keep an eye out, and thank you so much, and have a great evening / morning / afternoon, wherever you're from.
And be in touch with us. This conversation's not over.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for a great discussion.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Questions.
Bye.